Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Onyx, and on this channel I tend to strive for objective media analysis and critique. Now, what that means is a bit unclear for most viewers, so let us first define our playground as to avoid confusion later on. What I mean when I say objective media analysis is neither assessing the emotional qualities for individual viewers, nor disprove your feelings towards these media. I mean strictly assessing the quality of the craft at hand, while providing arguments for why individual elements do or don't work. This does not at all mean these videos are not falsifiable, which most of you going in probably know, but there are certainly individuals where such distinction is necessary. Many people, perhaps even the majority of people, would argue that assessing art, and by extension video games objectively, just isn't possible. This premise is false, since you can at least prove one piece of art takes much more effort, skill and time to be achieved than the other in terms of quality. Now, with this out of the way, we can focus on the subject at hand. Sekiro: Shadows Die Twice. The game was published in March 2019 by the renowned game developing studio From Software. After its release, it instantly became a hit, selling over 2 million copies in just 10 days. The developers are famous for making arguably hardcore, combat-focused games, which are renowned for being brutal and difficult. That's why Sekiro, a fast-paced, relentless experience, was praised among the community built around these games, even though it inspired a debate on difficulty in video games and accessibility in the game journalist sphere, which was, to put it mildly, not very clever. Sekiro, at the end of 2019, even got the Game of the Year award, beating games like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Death Stranding, and Devil May Cry 5. While I still think Sekiro is a worthwhile experience and it probably even deserves the 2019 award, I couldn't help but notice many problems that I've seen no one cover yet, and I would like to share my perspective on these problems. I will divide this video into a few different sections, or segments, each focusing on one problem, going from the more minor ones to the ones I generally consider to be serious flaws in the game's design. I will provide timestamps if you're interested in any one of the issues in particular on the screen now. Before I start, I would like to mention that this isn't meant to be a full-scale analysis of the game with the good and the bad, because an analysis would take a significantly longer amount of time, attention, and careful examination. I will solely focus on the elements of the game I consider to be either objectively flawed, or at least not to my taste, which I would like to preface every time when that's the case. I also assume you already have some knowledge about Sekiro, as I will directly reference the game's events, places, bosses, and characters. With that being said, let's delve right in. Now, this segment is going to be motivated by my own subjective reasons. As I stated, I go from the least important to the most, which I want to preface now, so if you aren't interested in that, skip right ahead to the next part. The world is, for the most part, logically consistent, unlike in Dark Souls 2, and is oftentimes stunningly beautiful with locations like the Fountainhead Palace, Ashina Castle, and the Senpou Temple. The problem I had with the world is that it baits possible shortcuts from one area to the other and doesn't deliver them afterwards. This is where I have to draw a connection to Dark Souls 1 in order for you to understand what I mean by that, so consider watching further if you want to avoid spoilers. After beating the de facto tutorial boss of Dark Souls 1, you are transported to the Firelink Shrine. This will be the central hub for the entirety of your journey. It is of great importance as it is one of the few places to grant you 10 flasks instead of the regular 5 upon resting at a bonfire. Most of the characters you encounter in-game will gather here, and it is also the place from which the entire map branches outwards. Wherever you go in the game, you always come back to the Firelink Shrine. Finally, the atmosphere of one of the few safe places is further developed by a calming soundtrack which you can now hear playing in the background, as it will be important later on. Upon your arrival to Firelink Shrine, you are told to ring the 2 bells of awakening to get to the city of the gods, Anor Londo. Thus you make your way up the decrepit city, unlocking a multitude of shortcuts, one of them connecting back to the Firelink Shrine. After defeating the gargoyles, you ring the first bell of awakening and proceed into the depths, the town's sewage system. This is a place for the unwanted, the outlaws, a place where criminals are thrown to be forever banished from the townships above. But even these undead who wander the depths wouldn't ever even attempt to enter the Blight Town. A location even deeper, built on fickle planks of wood resting atop a giant swamp, inhabited by ogres, infested leeches, mosquitoes and ghouls. There, you defeat the human spider mutant, Quelaag, and ring the second bell of awakening. You are now at the bottom of your known world, literally resting on top of hell, not knowing the way to go. You spent possibly hours trying to get here, and now you make your way up the elevator from which you get to a valley. You unlock a door, get to another elevator, and while you get up, you are presented to this. And this was the moment I instantly recognized the game as one of the best ones I ever played, even though I have come to acknowledge some of its important flaws since. I know I prolonged this segment maybe a bit too much and made it emotional, but all of that was to show you how interconnectivity can certainly make for a better experience through immersion. For the same reason, I perceive Bloodborne to be a fantastically constructed game in terms of world design, with its shortcut from Yargul to Old Yarnam and Forbidden Woods to Central Yarnam, even though they were maybe a bit unnecessary. I did this whole thing to show you how much excitement there was from my side when I saw the "does not open from this side" sign in Sekiro's abandoned temple, after they completely botched the interconnective aspect in Dark Souls 2 and 3, since it's that very message that always indicated the shortcut in Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1. Sekiro, however, merely baits the shortcut without actually delivering, or even explaining how the shortcut works, since the player later discovers it's a teleport to the top of the Ashina castle, placed just for convenience's sake. My question therefore is, how does this shortcut work? Why couldn't you have opened it from the other side at first, when you have no problem going through it both ways after you get to the castle? There is no visual indication for why this should be the case. Secondly, I understand the connection between Ishin and the sculptor, but why would there even be a shortcut from the temple to the castle in the first place? And the connection between these characters maybe makes it even worse. Sure, the sculptor helped Ishin in the rebellion, but we know Ishin has had experience with the sculptor not being reliable, cutting his arms off when he almost turned into the demon of hatred once. You wouldn't exactly want to teleport from your seat of power to someone who is this dangerous. And this isn't even the only occasion this happens. Earlier on, you can go into the Ashina outskirts cave where the first Headless resides and teleport to the Senpou temple. Not only does this not have any explanation, albeit faulty as in the last case whatsoever, but it's also blatantly obvious the shortcut was put there by the developers to get you to the Demon Bell quicker, again, out of convenience. One last example is the transition between Ashina Castle and the Senpou temple through the underground passage, as it is way too short if you actually take a look at the distance from either of the locations. Now, I don't want this segment to sound like I have some sort of a big issue with the game regarding its locations. However, it was a bit disappointing for me to see the same developers who made Bloodborne and Dark Souls were this uninterested in the interconnectivity and logical consistency of their world. It's a really small issue, one might even say a nitpick, but a valid nitpick nonetheless. And one that I personally did see as a disappointment, since no one sensible should be able to tell me with a straight face that meticulously crafted environments such as in the aforementioned games don't take much more effort than convenient shortcuts done as an afterthought in Sekiro. One last remark I have to bring up, since it will be a recurring pattern throughout this critique, is the peculiar connection Sekiro has with Dark Souls 2. If you are a player who remembers the horrendous catastrophe Dark Souls 2 was, you surely know there were a few moments where the game skipped vast portions of what the player sees only to cheat their way into a new location. Two prime examples being the paths from Majula to either Heidi's Tower of Flames or the Forest of the Giants. And it is the exact same problem as in Sekiro, as I stated, a nitpick. However, I did not bring this up for these inconsistencies themselves, but to slowly introduce you to a very uncomfortable pattern of Sekiro repeating the same mistakes as Dark Souls 2, because it sure as hell doesn't stop there. Now, let us continue right where we left off. The similarities of Sekiro and Dark Souls 2, which will become ever more evident and problematic, while simultaneously all the problems Sekiro has, Dark Souls 2 shares them. One of the main issues many people had with Dark Souls 2 was the sheer amount of bosses the game outright copied from one location to another, changed some minor details about them, and reused them later on. Examples being the Dragon Riders in the main game, and the Smelter Demon in the Crown of the Iron King DLC. I don't actually know the purpose behind rehashing these bosses aside from just reminding you that you are playing a game, but rather than do this in an interesting manner, the developers opted for this arguably lazy solution. In this segment, I will be talking about a set of enemies that spawn only once in a specific location and drop in memory, a tool used to enhance player strength. This is because there is one another set of enemies who spawn only once but wouldn't be considered the main sequence bosses, and memories are a good way to separate these two. I will cover the second set though, as it is more problematic in the next section. Now, on to the actual boss encounters. What I will give Sekiro is that its reappearance of bosses is much more interesting and creative than it was in Dark Souls 2. The bosses mostly get new phases added to their fight and a couple of new abilities. Their reappearance is also supported by the plot, however, it would still be much more challenging to create new encounters, and it pains me as I know From Software is well suited to do the job when wanting to. And it wouldn't even be a problem if it happened once or twice, but the ratio of boss types that appear only once to the ones you fight on multiple occasions is either 11:4, 11:5, 7:4, or 5:5, depending on how you do the calculations provided on the screen. Furthermore, the actual encounters do even worse. One of the bosses can be fought 3 times, and the ratio between the encounters is either 5 to 11, 6 to 11, 9 to 7, or even 11 to 5. This means that if you are in a boss encounter, chances are you either already have fought some of its variations, or you will. There are literally more duplicates than there are one-of-a-kind encounters. And that is ignoring the so-called inner boss fights added as a post-end content. I will list the bosses below so that you can see what I am talking about. Ishin Ashina is just a reused name, not even the asset is the same in the 2 encounters with him, so I don't really consider him being reused as a big problem. This is precisely the reason I decided to list all the bosses included in the aforementioned ratios, since I didn't want to be unreasonable or unfair to the game, and if I was, you could make up your own mind based on what you see in this segment. Al is used 2 times, even though the 2 encounters are not quite the same. His second instance in the second memory of the Hirata estates present you with the old moveset as well as a new thrusting attack you can counter with Mikiri. His second phase is vastly different to the previous fight both in aesthetics and moveset. I have to stop here and appreciate the effort to distinguish the second appearance in a significant way. Such will, however, mostly not be the case with further examples. Guardian Ape is really getting to the level where it's just blatant laziness, since his second appearance in the Deaths of Ashina really wasn't even necessary. He has the same moveset as the second phase of the first fight in the Sunken Valley passage, but they added a second ape, painted it brown, and made that abomination a boss fight. This is really painfully stupid, and I'm not saying this because the fight is hard, since I don't think it is. It's just really cheap, and the only thing being added is artificial difficulty, which we will get to. Genichiro is used 3 times throughout the game, once at the very start, where you will, just by the way, not get any reward for defeating him, and the scenario plays out practically the same way. I'm assuming because the developers didn't want to think of any additional narrative that would play out in that scenario. However, this is an example of poor writing, one that twists the narrative in order to achieve what it wants, which all writers should avoid at all costs. This goes in similar vein to how the outcome of your dialogue with Kuro forces you to pick one of the options despite offering 2 of them upon him asking you to break the ties of immortal severance, and I would strongly argue this is absolutely beyond stupid.
それを手伝ってはくれぬか。
父よ、鉄の掟よ。できませぬ。巫女様をお守りすること。それが我が父より課せられし掟なれば。
そなたは私を救うため、幾度死に、そして蘇ってくれた。2度か、3度か、あるいは数えきれぬほどなのか。
巫女様をお守りするためならば、幾度でも。
そなたを不死の永劫の任に縛りたくはないのだ。狼よ、共に不死立ちをなしてくれ。
御意。
ありがとう、狼よ。
Now, back to Genichiro. The boss then appears again in the Ashina Castle, which is probably the best example of how to implement a boss fight rehashed the right way, although he still has the same moveset from the start of the game aside from the third phase, where he has an improved thrust and a lightning attack. What I really have a problem with though, is how Genichiro flees the scene for you to fight him for the 3rd time. The encounter is exactly the same and only serves the narrative. Although one might argue the 3rd fight with Genichiro shows the player how much they've improved, it is a nuisance in all the attempts you fail and have to fight him again in order to get to the real fight, and there certainly are better methods to make the player realize their growth. The Corrupted Monk is perhaps the worst instance of a boss in Sekiro being reused. Hell, maybe it's even worse than any instance of a boss being reused in any Soulsborne game, since you can choose to fight him practically 2 times in a row, with almost the same moveset as the first time, only with a 2nd and a 3rd phase added to the fight. The 3rd phase has tons of added value since it pukes and has a centipede in the place his head should be. The asset in both instances is more or less the same, aside from it being an apparition the first time around. Now, I want to preface this with saying that, from now on, what I am presenting you with as factual evidence to my claims of Sekiro being a flawed game is actually becoming a problem, not just a nitpick. We will cover similar enemies to the bosses, who in contrast to them drop prayer beads instead of memories upon death. Ones that are usually called mini-bosses. Their placement in the world is largely unexplained, much less so their reappearance in most cases when it happens. I am absolutely sure you could think of reasons for their repeated use, however, at that point you are essentially doing the developer's homework. It would be pretty nonsensical to prolong this any further, so before moving on to similar ratios added in the previous segment, let us list the enemies I am talking about. The generals and a leader are a set of mini-bosses appearing at locations pertaining to Ashina. You can find a total of 3 generals and 1 leader throughout the game, with them later appearing as regular enemies. Each one is distinguished with a unique name. Aside from the leader you fight at the very start of the game, their appearance only changes negligibly. However, it would make sense you would assign the members of the military with similar clothing. I do think, though, that it would have been much better if they had actually created more varied assets and combat styles with these types of enemies. Seeing as it is largely logical though, we move on to the next mini-boss. The chained ogres are much more problematic, mainly with the boss being terribly executed mechanically, but we will get to that later. He appears a total of 3 times throughout the game, and the fight is always 100% the same, aside from the fact that the one in Ashina Outskirts in the endgame doesn't have a mini-boss health bar, which is a bit redeeming, I guess. I didn't count the one in the Palace Feeding Grounds because it looks completely different, but the skill set, if you choose to attack it, is also absolutely the same. The Drunkard appears a grand total of 4 times within the game, and 3 of the times he looks and behaves absolutely the same. His appearance changes in the final chapter of the game in Ashina Outskirts, but it is just a reskin that spews fire instead of poison. His second appearance in the depths of Ashina has absolutely no reason to be there except for the actual boss of the location being too easy. This, combined with his other appearance the second time we visit the Hirata estate, where he is complemented by the Lone Shadow just to make the fight more difficult, is already getting to one of the biggest issues with the game, but seeing as this is discussed in its own segment, we will move on. The 7 Ashina Spears appear 2 times in the game, the second instance again foreshadowing one of the big issues since he is accompanied by the 5th instance of the general type enemy, this time without his own health bar, only providing a nuisance to deal with while wanting to kill the main threat. The Shichiman Warriors appear 3 times, albeit with a different loot. This is where this list starts to get quite egregious, seeing as there is no explanation whatsoever for why they reappear. The Ashina Elites appear 2 times in the game and are 100% the same in regards to their appearance, except for the fact the second one has, and I'm not kidding you, red eyes. Snake Eyes appear 2 times and are mechanically retarded, since they have you either luck out its grab or be so careful that the fight turns into baiting its attacks, punishing and then retreating. Rinse and repeat until they are dead and you have a terrible mini-boss. The Lone Shadow appears 4 times as a mini-boss in the game. However, aside from these 4, there is one more instance where it could be argued he's the main boss, and that is the Lone Shadow accompanying the Drunkard in Hal's memory, since he's a much more persistent threat throughout the fight due to his extreme agility compared to most enemies. When you take into account they are mostly accompanied by other agile enemies, and in one instance can even summon dogs, which are infamously annoying, you definitely see Artificial Difficulty's ugly head rearing once again. Let us move on. The Blazing Bill's second appearance is insulting in the same way Blue Smelter Demon was handled in Dark Souls 2, and the fight adds no value whatsoever. And the finish belongs to Headless, whose 5 appearances are the biggest insult I think there is with any of these enemies in the game. I will get to him later though. To wrap up what is probably already a pretty clearly emerging pattern, I want to stress I don't consider this to be some kind of an objective game-breaking problem. However, if you still don't acknowledge this as a flaw, how minor it might seem, then let me ask you this. Does it take more skill to craft 11 enemies and place them 32 times into the game, or create 32 unique mini-bosses? And I think the answer to this question is pretty clear regardless of how you view this game and its quality, and it goes to show the developers clearly haven't learned from their mistakes made in Dark Souls 2 with revamping bosses and insultingly placing them into the environment just to remind you are playing a game. One might argue the same problem exists within other Souls games. Seeing as I previously praised Dark Souls 1, you would probably highlight the ones present in the Demon Runes. I am going to cover myself preemptively by first saying this is just blatant whataboutism, and even if it was a problem but I wouldn't consider it to be one, that would just mean I'm a hypocrite, not that it isn't an issue in this game. Secondly, the reusing of enemies in Demon Runes is linked to the lore in a pretty logical fashion. Hell, the location itself is named the Demon Runes, but the best argument I have is that the game doesn't present every Capra demon as its own boss, nor does it present every Taurus demon as its own boss. One and only example where the game does this is the Demon Fire Sage, and I do actually consider that to be one of the worst bosses of Dark Souls 1. Not just because it is a copy, but also because of its horrendous quality, or rather lack thereof. Now, if you're interested in a similar ratio I presented for the bosses in the last segment, I used the same methods of counting the mini-boss types as in the previous part, and it turns out to be either 18 to 11 or 7 to 11. Again, the calculation methods appearing on screen. As for the actual encounters themselves, the ratio of unique to copy-pasted is either 18 to 21 in the better scenario or 7 to 32, meaning firstly that there is only 7 mini-bosses you won't see reappear in the game, and your odds of seeing the mini-boss you currently fight are close to 5 to 1. And that's not even taking into account that 2 of the 7 fights you won't see multiple times are the Great Serpent, which you actually do see multiple times, however you can only beat it one time, and the Great Colored Carp, which isn't exactly a fight. One of the 7 fights is the Okamili the Shizu, which is a reskin of the default enemy from the same location. One of the 7 fights is the Miss Noble, a fight notorious for being laughably easy and not even worth mentioning. Altogether, this means that if you want a list of fights that aren't a complete joke, you actually fight them and they are unique, you will end up with the Armored Warrior, or Rin of the Water, and the Shinobi Hunter. Although not as severe, I decided to include these 3 problems as they are present throughout the game on many occasions, as will be shown in the examples playing between this and the next part. For this part, you will need to understand what I mean when I say tracking. As you probably already know what grabs and hitboxes are, I won't be explaining those. Tracking in a video game occurs when an enemy follows the player's position to land an attack. Sekiro, however, tracks the player a bit excessively, as you often find yourself within the enemy's attack range fractions of a second after you dodged their attack, which, according to the attack's trajectory you saw, should not have landed at your position were it not for extremely obsessive tracking. Now, I know most people would likely argue tracking and or hitboxes aren't really a problem in a game based around deflections and parries rather than dodging, and that players who experience problem with those should just adapt to Sekiro's unique playstyle. However, firstly, I still think even if your game doesn't revolve around dodging, using the dodge button shouldn't be discouraged by ridiculous cheating on part of the developers. I would equate this to people defending bad horror films' decisions by saying these films would be uninteresting if the characters weren't totally stupid. Just because you need something to happen, you should not warp and bend reality to better suit your rules. Secondly, and I think this is much more important to the actual experience you will have in the game once you learn its rhythm and start deflecting. Some enemies cannot be deflected. Some enemies are meant to be overcome by dodging. One appalling example of this is the Chained Ogre, who will sometimes bend mid-flight to catch you with his grab. This is also the reason I decided to include all of these 3 issues in one section. They are ultimately linked to one another. Grabs, where the player wasn't even present in the area, is another frequent occurrence, especially with the Chained Ogre or Emma, who can grab you when you are literally standing behind her. All of these combined sometimes create quite an annoying pattern that can sometimes even kill you, which, while not being a problem on its own, is further exacerbated due to the reasons stated in the next chapters. Before we move on to it, though, there are a few clips I would like to show you to bolster this argument. Up until now, I've covered things that are of mild annoyance. As I said in the intro, we are progressing through the issues I found in an ascending manner of importance. Now we get to the big stuff. Although I did preface my assessment with stating my assumption was that you have either played or watched someone else play Sekiro, I feel like the next segment should be explained a bit further. Sekiro has a dying mechanic in which, if you die, you are offered to be revived, hence the title Shadows Die Twice, or even more times depending on how far you've progressed into the game. This is, at least from my point of view, a welcome addition, as the player sometimes isn't responsible for their death. I wouldn't necessarily say the other Soulsborne games would benefit from this as well, because that's for a whole other debate, straying too far away from the topic at hand. This reviving mechanic, though, has a downside, although it is not inherent to it. Every time you die definitively, meaning you aren't able to use the respawn mechanic anymore or you choose not to, you are sent to a Sculptor's Idol, a checkpoint, functioning much in the same way a bonfire does in Dark Souls. You dying and being sent back to the previous checkpoint increases the probability of spreading Dragon Rot, a disease affecting NPCs and their quest lines by halting them, if you receive a so-called Rot Essence for that particular NPC. It isn't as troublesome as it may sound, because they will still trade with you and let you interact with them in some way. What is worse, and I do see as a genuine problem, is the other effect of Dragon Rot spreading. It decreases the chance of receiving unseen aid, which is a probability-based mechanic that determines whether your XP and money will be halved upon death. You start out with 30% and drop with every rot essence packet received. The problem with this is that the game developers actively try to punish the players for even trying to tackle the game's bosses, and in effect for trying to get better at it and cutting their chances to do so. The player, if he simply isn't experienced or skilled enough, if you will, then has to resort to either farm the XP or cure Dragon Rod, with a limited item called the Dragon Tear Droplet. It can easily happen to inexperienced players that they use their Dragon Tear Droplets too many times and simply aren't able to finish the questlines they started out. And allow me to make myself clear. I am all for making games difficult and hardcore. What I am absolutely not for is dick-moving your way into doing so. Let me show you why I think Dark Souls does it better. Each time you die in Dark Souls, you drop your souls on the ground and are encouraged by the game to go and get them. Or you could even say that you are encouraged to get better by leaving you with the possibility to retrieve them. Sekiro, on the other hand, gives you only 30% chance to keep your stuff and decreasing it every time you die just to fuck with you. This doesn't urge the player to get better to improve in order to recover what they lost. Death shouldn't be punished by discouraging the player from trying further, but by the act of dying itself. I ultimately don't get the point of Dragon Ace even being a thing. The game could easily just erase the entire system and save the hassle altogether. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the point where the connections to Dark Souls 2 start to get really uncomfortable, moving us to the next section. Now, as you've probably guessed from the closing statement of the previous segment, it's yet again time to compare this game to Dark Souls 2. If you aren't familiar with the concept of artificial difficulty, it is the developers trying to make a game harder using cheap methods that aren't really interesting or valuable in any way, just for the sake of making the player lose. Now, how would you achieve that, you ask? Well, there are a couple of ways. One of them is having the enemies have really large health pools, or you could have them have really high damage, maybe even kill you with a single blow. Now, which way of artificially increasing the difficulty has Sekiro opted for? The worst one, which is, in my opinion, adding more stuff to really uninteresting or copy-pasted bosses, rather than having to craft one compelling boss. I will admit Sekiro is much better suited for multi-enemy combat than Dark Souls is, but it still absolutely works much better in one-on-one encounters. The thing is, even if it wasn't this way, it is still annoyingly lazy when the developers simply opt to focus more on difficulty than intricate design. One mini-boss in particular is heavily suffering from this problem, and that's Juzor the Drunkard, especially in your second encounter with him. Fighting him for the first time with his minions around was annoying enough, since the only difference between a one-on-one combat with him and the one we got is that you have to clear the enemies out first by staying away from him. It doesn't add anything in any way, shape or form to the experience and is only there to make the boss more difficult artificially. The second time, though, is just a plain nightmare to play. I will admit, the fight is more difficult, but it isn't in any way more interesting. It only boils down to a mess of you trying to lure the Lone Shadow away from the fatty, punishing him, and then being frustrated by the fact that his posture is going to rebuild because Juzor arrived and you have to run away from him. Another fight that is annoying in a similar manner is Masanaga the Spearbearer, who is surrounded by multiple dogs. Once you kill them, it's a regular Lone Shadow fight that doesn't bring anything new to the table. I could talk about more examples of this in detail, but I figured I would only give one more and then list the rest. The general you fight right after you beat the Chained Ogre, Tenzen Yamauchi, is designed in a manner that is supposed to piss you off every time you die to him, since you have to clear the whole area all over again, which is fun at first but then becomes repetitive rather quickly. And, as I promised, we are nowhere near the end. The Chained Ogre, the third general, all 4 encounters with the Drunkards, as I mentioned previously, the second encounter with the 7 Ashen Spears, a number of encounters against the Lone Shadows, the first encounter with the Long Arm Centipede, and the list goes on. Each of these has at least one powerful or a multitude of annoying enemies who are only there to provide additional artificial challenge. You have probably at some point already faced them, and the fight is therefore quite pointless, as it adds nothing new to the table and isn't quite as interesting as it would had the developers simply thought of a new design or at least a new moveset. None of these examples, though, are as insulting in my opinion as the second fight with the Headless Ape. This boss is one of the reasons I decided to write this critique, because it is simply so disappointing, so lacking in creativity, and becomes so obvious the game is desperate to catch you off guard, that it speaks volumes of why I've come to try and convince you of some of this game's flaws. You come to a place near to where you already once fought a mini-boss and are presented with the boss you already killed. After beating the first phase, in jumps a second, brown ape immediately smearing shit over my foolish belief that the developers had learned anything from the blue smell to deeming catastrophe of a boss fight. The only thing different about the second instance of this fight is you frantically run around the arena waiting for an opening, which can be quite tedious and punish every time the apes get a bit further apart. No value whatsoever is added with this troglodytic abomination of a boss fight, and the game's attempts to kill me have, to add insult to the injury, fallen short, because I beat it on my first try, making the fight only a nuisance. Now, of course, this last part is my subjective experience regarding difficulty, so it's not really a part of my point, but the rest of what I said is absolutely true. This reeks of laziness, which is only exacerbated after you defeat the boss, and in place of the two apes now is another boss fight, one which you probably already fought against. That means, just as a reminder, that this one place hosts 3 different boss fights, and all of those 3 are boss fights you in all likelihood already encountered. Now, we still didn't get to the end, although we are already at this segment's nitpick, the Headless. The Headless is an enemy you can encounter 5 times throughout the game, each dropping a different buff for the player. These buffs' limited versions can be found throughout the map, however, this mini-boss technically allows you to use them infinitely once defeated. It is, therefore, only logical that one would make such an arguably game-changing boss very difficult, as is the case with the Headless. However, I am not really certain the developers opted for the best way to do this, and I would even go as far as to argue the way they did it is unnecessarily tedious and poorly executed. Why is the Headless so difficult, then? Well, firstly, his surrounding makes you move slower, and he can teleport to you when you move too far away from this area of effect. Secondly, and I would argue more importantly, his blade fills up the terror bar upon hit or deflection. As you probably know, terror is a mechanic that instantly kills you when its bar is fully filled, similar to how curse functions in Dark Souls, although the repercussions are not as severe here in Sekiro. You can counteract terror by applying the pacifying agent. And lastly, the Headless takes a significantly lower amount of damage without first applying Divine Confetti to your blade, an item which is among the rare ones. And all these aspects combined make it a tedious fight at best, forcing an unexperienced player to grind for the aforementioned items and stack up from the ground up each time they fail. Stupid as it is, once the player has enough of the pacifying agent, the fight isn't all that difficult. Terror in this case doesn't create much challenge, however, if you don't have the necessary items you can't make up for it with skill. It is only a test of patience and how much you are willing to grind your way to victory. My question then is, why not simply get rid of the terror mechanic altogether? It adds no interesting challenge whatsoever and only serves to undermine the play for no other reason than that of the game needing to be hard to match the overall From Software style. As we finally reach the conclusion, there is one more thing I would like to mention. Although there have been parts where I excessively insulted the game, this video's message is not supposed to be one of Sekiro being a bad game outright. In my view, the positives overshadow the negatives and make Sekiro a pleasant experience altogether. So my answer to the question whether you should or should not play Sekiro would have to be yes, but I hope you enjoyed watching it and considered some of the points I bring to the table, or at least view some aspects of the game in a different light now. This has been Onyx, and I thank you for watching.